Empirical formulas. There are different kinds of chemical formulas. One of them is called an empirical formula. An empirical means determined by experiment. And the empirical formula is going to give us the simplest whole number ratio of atoms. The simplest whole number ratio of atoms. We can find the empirical formula from the percent composition or from the masses of each element present in a sample. And this last way, with the masses, we're going to do that in lab, I think this week. Yeah, we're going to do that this week in lab. We're going to take magnesium metal and react it with oxygen, and we'll be able to weigh the mass of the magnesium and the mass of the magnesium oxide product, and we'll be able to experimentally determine the mass of magnesium and the mass of oxygen. And from that, we'll calculate the formula of magnesium oxide. Oh, one more thing to swell, but yeah, no, this is fine. So here's an example of an empirical formula, CH, 1 carbon and 1 hydrogen. That is the simplest ratio, 1 to 1. Like a fraction, in simplest form, that cannot be reduced. Okay, so 1 over 1, you can't reduce that. The actual molecular formula for this compound is C6H6. That's a ratio or a fraction of 6 to 6. And that can be reduced to 1 to 1. And so the empirical formula shows those, the subscripts in their lowest form. The molecular formula is the actual formula of the compound and shows how many atoms of each element are actually present. So what ends up happening is that the molecular formula is some multiple of the empirical formula. So the empirical formula times n, where n is an integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that sort of thing. Now, like for something like water, the actual molecular formula for water is H2O. The empirical formula is also H2O, because that's a ratio of hydrogen to oxygen of 2 to 1, and that cannot be reduced. Hydrogen peroxide has a molecular formula of H2O2. That has a ratio of 2 to 2, which can be reduced to 1 to 1. And so the molecular formula for hydrogen peroxide is HO. So sometimes the empirical formula and the molecular formula are the same. And sometimes the molecular formula is just a multiple of the empirical formula. So determine the empirical formula for each of the following molecular formulas. Well, I kind of already did A for you. H2O2, what's the lowest ratio of hydrogen to oxygen? It'd be 1 to 1, so this would be HO. How about C2H6? That's a ratio of 1 to 3, so the empirical formula is CH3. We would get that by dividing these subscripts by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1, 6 divided by 2 is 3, and so we get a subscript of 1 and 3. How about CCl4? That's the lowest ratio is 1 to 4, and so the empirical formula is the same as the molecular formula. This making sense? So, yeah, let's not go to the next section just yet. You should be able to recognize whether something is an empirical or a molecular formula. And if given a molecular formula, you should be able to figure out what the empirical formula is just by getting the lowest ratio.